Okay, everybody. So, in part 4 of Japanese civilization from prehistory to 1868, we are primarily going to be focusing on the importation of Chinese culture into Japan and the development of what eventually becomes known as the Ritsuryo State. So, before I do that, I just want to do a brief recap of the introduction of Buddhism, which I talked about in the previous video. So, in the 530s to 550s, we don't know the exact date. It's somewhere in that 20-year period. The king of Pakche, which was a kingdom in Korea, sends a diplomatic mission to the ancient Japanese court. And one of the things they bring is, well, a couple of the things they bring are a couple Buddhist holy texts. So these are sutras, and they bring a statue of the Buddha. And the Japanese court was looking at this thing and they're like, all right, what is that? I don't know what that is. Because the traditional way of doing Japanese religion, the thing that eventually, long term, develops into Shinto, had gods. They were called kami, but they don't really have like holy texts. They don't really have, artistic depictions of the kami. The Buddha, the fact that there was a deity or something like a deity in a physical, artistic representation was new. So there's a debate. Well, should we introduce Buddhism? It's a foreign religion, but at the same time, it looks like the states on the mainland, so China, Korea, etc., used Buddhism to kind of help prop up their state. So some clans, some families among the nobility in ancient Japan, notably the Soga clan, who probably had some Korean ancestry or Korean contacts, were like, yes, absolutely, let's do this. They were opposed by others, like the Mononobe. So there was a civil war. Chinese texts called this the Civil War of Wa. In the process, Buddhist shrines are burned, temples are burned, a statue of the Buddha is hacked up, a statue of the Buddha is thrown into a canal, etc. But in 587, roughly, the Mononobe are defeated. The Soga win, and Buddhism is allowed to flourish in Japan. Going along with this, the Soga build a temple. They build a pagoda in Japan to the Buddha. And the Nihon Shoki, which is an ancient Japanese text we have that we basically depend on for a lot of ancient Japanese history, records that in this period, 46 Buddhist temples are built in Japan by 623. And we have about 50 temples from roughly that period excavated in Japan. So it seems like that particular portion of the chronicle is correct. But the implementation of Buddhism does something to ancient Japan. It begins to change it for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think, is the physical way it's changed, and that is in the architectural style and the manner in which the Japanese begin to build this stuff. So ancient Japanese structures, ancient Japanese shrines, stuff like that, don't have a foundation. They're just built right on top of the ground. They have thatched roofs. They're built with, the lumber is, cut and dried. It's seasoned, but it's not like necessarily cut into planks. It's very, raw would be the right way to kind of describe the architecture. It's very raw, kind of primitive. Buddhism, on the other hand, brings a method of constructing buildings that features a foundation. Some of the stuff is made of stone. The walls, for instance, definitely a foundation. The boards are cut. Some of them are actually highly stylized. Some of them are painted. The roofs are made of, if not stone, definitely, terracotta and tile. So there's a physical difference now that the religion is bringing into Japan in the manner in which the Japanese are building the temples for this new religion. So that's one way Japan begins to be changed by religion. The other way, the other main way, is that Prince Shotoku, who was alive approximately in the 500s, was a member of the imperial family who was very interested in Buddhism. So now that the Civil War of Wa is over and the Soga clans kind of come out on top, there's, aristocratic elements that are interested in Buddhism. Well, now they have the backing of an imperial family member. So now it's really cool to get Buddhism in Japan. So this is really how that religion begins. Now, as Buddhism is coming into Japan, it brings a new system of architecture, but it also brings continental methods of statecraft and other political and philosophical ideas, specifically from China. So China is a civilization by, this point, so the 500s and 600s roughly CE, is at least 1,000 years old. At least, probably more. Although when exactly a civilization called China begins, people fight about that. But at this point, it's at least 1,000 years old. And Buddhism in China is at least 900 to 1,000 years old. At least. So when it comes into Japan, it's looked at as, well, a very old, successful civilization used this religion, so they must have done something right. So they take Chinese institutions and Chinese ideas, and they bring it into Japan for a couple reasons. The first is to potentially ward off a hypothetical Chinese invasion, because there are signs that maybe that was going to be a thing that could potentially happen. So the bringing in Chinese methods of statecraft alongside Buddhism to help strengthen the imperial court. So to ward off Chinese invasion is one of the reasons they're doing it. Another reason is to really centralize what's going on and to really try to control the uji, or the aristocratic clans in Japan. So the Japanese leader of the Yamato family, the family that does eventually become the Japanese imperial line, starts taking the Chinese term emperor. They start using Chinese political institutions. So if you're an emperor, well, you can't have threats to your rule. So they align the aristocrats alongside themselves. And they do this on Chinese lines. So the way the Chinese did this was they established a series of court ranks. Japan develops 12 of them, like China had. Each court rank is broken into an upper level and a lower level. And you could, technically speaking, you could rise up through the ranks, but really, by and large, where you fall in that hierarchy is based upon your initial status at birth. So, when the court aristocracy gets worked into this ranking system, and when the emperor becomes the Japanese emperor, when he starts calling himself that, he takes control of all the court's land. He takes control of all the land of the aristocrats. And he parcels it out to them. So it becomes in the interest of the imperial family and of the court aristocracy to basically support each other, because the court aristocrats don't have to go out and try to defend the legitimacy of their claims to their land. The imperial family does that for them. So as long as they support one another, they got a good situation. After the Civil War of Wa, and after the Soga come out on top, they don't ever attempt to really overthrow... We'll talk about this in a sec. They don't ever really attempt, as far as we know, to overthrow the imperial family, largely for the reason I just outlined. It's in the interest of the imperial family and the court nobility to, support one another. But they do begin to pull strings from behind the scenes, and they do this by marrying Soga daughters to Japanese emperors. So now they're slowly working their way into the imperial family, but they still don't need to overthrow it because, well, why would you do that? You have to make a new government. That's stupid. It's easier just to have the imperial family back you up, and then you just pull the strings behind the scenes. It's just easier to do, so the Soga felt. And that sets a precedent for a lot of what comes throughout Japanese history. The emperor's never really overthrown. The only time the Soga, as far as I'm aware, really attempt this, and this isn't even really an attempt, this is just like one of these aberrations, these weird things that crops up in primary sources. One of the Soga, Soga no Umako, is recorded as building this thing. We don't really know what it was. It's not a castle. It's not really a fortified settlement. He has his estate in his large manor house, and then the primary sources record that he built like a palisade around it, and he has like 2 or 3 towers, and he has some armed guards. We don't really know much more than that, but we don't really know what this thing was. As far as we're aware, he wasn't stockpiling weapons or anything, but the fact that he fortified his own dwelling is interesting, because this doesn't necessarily happen in this period with court aristocrats. That's more of a frontier thing, which we'll talk about later. But in 645, a lot of the imperial family is sick of this. So they get another powerful aristocratic clan, the Nakatomi, to help them overthrow the Soga. So basically what happens is the people that are orchestrating this coup get the Nakatomi and their soldiers. They go into the imperial palace. They go into the imperial audience hall, I guess would be the word. They bar the doors. The Soga don't really think anything of this, because why would they? They're really the guys in charge. And then the Nakatomi soldiers and everyone else draw their weapons, and they basically wipe out the Soga in the imperial palace. So there's a coup in 645 where, the Soga clan's not, destroyed outright, but their power's basically broken, and all of the key figures are dead. So, in order to strengthen the state even more and basically ensure that this doesn't happen, the people that orchestrated the coup now institute, in 645 and 646, the Taika Reform. So this literally means something like the Great Reforms. It's exactly what you think it sounds like. The Taika Reforms basically get the aristocracy. So I mentioned that they surrender their land. This is the institution whereby they are forced to do that. They surrender their land, and they receive land instead according to their court rank. So it becomes worth their interest to basically support each other. The Nakatomi are renamed the Fujiwara clan, and in order to reconstitute the imperial state and really ensure powers retained in the hands of the imperial family, the Taika Reformed basically try to make Japan a Chinese-style state. So we have this thing we do with the aristocrats, we do massive land reform, etc. So in order to make Japan a Chinese or a quasi-Chinese state, besides dealing with the aristocracy, there's a couple things you gotta do. They look at China, and they're like, well, China has a permanent capital. Japan had capitals, but none of them were permanent. In traditional Japanese folklore and mythology, so the stuff that does eventually become Shinto, death is considered unclean. So when an emperor died, usually everybody would just pick up stakes and go found a new capital city, a place that's not tainted by the stench of death. Well, this stops now, because the Chinese don't do this. So they found a permanent capital. First it's Nara, then it's Heiankyo, the city that eventually becomes Kyoto. And rather than just pulling up stakes and have everybody just move every time an emperor dies, what starts happening is, well, now an emperor dies, this particular chunk of the city is tainted by death. So until we get priests inside and we can cleanse it, we'll just move to another portion of the city. So that's basically how they start doing things. The Chinese also organize their country along, bureaucratic administration with provinces, districts, etc. So the Japanese build their state along bureaucratic lines with provinces and districts. The Chinese register their population, the Japanese register their population. The Chinese assign farmland based on familial size, needs, etc. The Japanese do this. The Chinese have regular taxation, the Japanese have regular taxation. The Chinese have a unified military, the Chinese try to build a unified military. You ever see that movie Mean Girls, in the beginning, when they're going over the queen bees of the school, and they're interviewing all the different girls in the high school, and oh, Regina George bought army pants and flip-flops, so I went out and I bought army pants and flip-flops, etc. This is basically that idea. You're trying to institute what you think the top guy on the block has, because, well, if it worked for them, it must work for us. That doesn't necessarily happen later on, but we'll talk about that. So, by the year 700, the Taika Reforms have basically radically altered the Japanese government. The bureaucracy is now modeled on the way they do things in China, specifically Tang China. So in 669, the Nakatomi family is renamed Fujiwara. So the Fujiwara clan is a remarkably important family in ancient Japanese history for two reasons. Well, three reasons, really. One, they have a massive amount of land, and this gives them power, specifically in northern Japan. So, only high-ranking families in the court aristocracy get bureaucratic offices. They get some land, but the Fujiwara keep control over the biggest estate, so this gives them power. In the north of Japan, the Fujiwara, to the extent they control the north of Japan anyway, the Fujiwara develop their military power, so they become known for soldiers. And lastly, they do exactly what the Soga were trying to do by marrying in Soga daughters into the imperial family and controlling them and pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The Fujiwara do the same thing with their daughters. They marry them into the imperial family. So the result is that the old aristocratic families don't suffer from these reforms because, yeah, they have to surrender their land, but they don't really suffer anything because they get their land back along with a bunch of fancy titles, and now that land is basically guaranteed. So the problems that were inherent in the Yamato state in the 500s and the 600s, so weak government, civil wars, or the Civil War of Wa, this question of what to do with a religion, a potential Chinese invasion, military disasters on the mainland, etc. How strong is the imperial family? All these problems get resolved by about the end of the 600s through the implementation of Buddhism, Confucianism, other Chinese methods of doing things as far as the government's concerned, the Taika reforms. So this really revolutionizes how the Japanese state begins to conduct itself. Okay, so in the previous videos, one of the things I kind of emphasized was that Japan has a different way of doing things from the mainland. They appear to have been a relatively matriarchal society. But now that they're bringing in Chinese institutions, what's happening is, well, the Chinese method of ordering their society is going along with that and coming into the Japanese islands. So the Japanese were matrilineal, usually. The Chinese were patriarchal. So the implementation of something like Confucianism, for example, which is based around relationships organized along patrilineal lines, is very different from the Japanese method of bilateral and matrilineal kinship systems. So in order to adopt Tang law, by which I mean Chinese law, which gets worked into the Taika reforms, means to adopt the Chinese patrilineal kinship system, but this doesn't happen quickly. This doesn't happen easily. For about, I don't know, 500 years, roughly, this is like an ongoing problem as far as Japanese aristocrats are concerned. Like, how exactly do we work women into the system? Where do women fit in? In a way, this is something that really is not fully settled until the samurai take control in about 1200. So it's a very long-standing, arduous process of how do we adapt a matriarchal society to a patriarchal one. Now, the implementation of all of these different ideas gives the Japanese state enough power to basically attempt further expansion, so they go out from central Japan, and they also go into Korea. So I went over this in the previous couple of videos. We have the three kingdoms of Korea here. Goryeo is in yellow, Pakche is in blue. Pakche is the country that sent Buddhism initially over to Japan. Silla is in magenta. And then we have Kaya in the bottom. So Kaya I talked about in the previous video. This is what looks like a confederacy on the Korean Peninsula. There's an idea that it was a Japanese outpost. We don't really know. It's not important for what I'm going to say here, but what is important are these three kingdoms, Goryeo, Pakche, and Silla. So the Silla are allied very closely with the Chinese. So by about 660, with Chinese help, the Sillans had conquered Pakche, and they begin to conquer Goryeo. So by the end of the 660s, the Korean peninsula is unified under Silla. So now Japan has this problem of, well, on the mainland, we have no more friends, because Pakche is gone. We are opposed by the Tang Dynasty and Silla, both of whom don't like us. So part of the reason the Taika reforms are implemented when they're implemented is to help strengthen the Japanese state to try to ward off a potential invasion by both of these powers. So this is the political situation that's going on in big picture form as this coup in 645 is happening and as Japanese expansion is happening on the Japanese islands in the 600s. So I mentioned in the beginning that we're going to be talking about the Ritsuryo State. what the Ritsuryo State refers to is, so after 645, there's a palace coup, the Taika Reforms are implemented, and I'm repeating this here because it's that important. That law code that is implemented is called the Ritsuryo. So it's based on Tang-style criminal law, Ritsu, and Tang-style civil law, Ritsuryo. So when that's done, the Japanese state adopts a new name for itself. It is no longer Yamato or the Yamato Confederacy, as it's sometimes known in primary sources. Now it's Sunrise Land, the land of the rising sun, Nihon. That's literally what that word means. Those characters translate to land of the rising sun. So this actually gets used as a burn to a Chinese emperor, and I can't remember the date, but a Japanese emperor wrote a letter to a Chinese emperor, and the gist of it was basically the ruler of the land where the sun rises, meaning Japan, greets the ruler of the land where the sun sets, meaning China. China liked to emphasize itself as being the Middle Kingdom, the place where everything emanates from. So the fact that they get a letter saying that, well, you're not the center, and our place is the place where the sun hits first, the Chinese didn't like that. So that's a brief little aside. So going along with all of this is, well, we've implemented a Chinese code of law. Okay. So they've given us a law code. They've given us political systems and philosophy. What else can they give us? So in the late 600s, the Japanese sent some missions to Korea. They sent missions to China between 600 and 659. Mainly they're going to Korea, but we have 7 going to China after the revolution and after the Taika reforms, everything is implemented, and then becomes scared by China. That stops. So I mentioned earlier they built a capital. What does that capital look like? I'm going to throw up maps and diagrams in the next couple videos when we start talking about like court culture, because this is going to be really important as it pertains to the city. But these are capitals. First at Nara, and then Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, that are built in the Chinese manner. So these are large, unwalled, rectangular cities. There's a walled palace compound, which has some defense. It's situated in the north of the capital. So the Japanese word for emperor, Tenno, doesn't really mean emperor. Tenno means something like heavenly sovereign of the North Star. So the idea being that if you look up in the sky at night, the North Star doesn't move. Everything revolves around Polaris. Well, that must be divine. So the Japanese emperor associates themselves with Polaris, with the North Star. So heavenly sovereign of the North Star, you see the propaganda connection you can easily make with that, which is why the palace is in the north. So it's organized on a north-south, east-west grid. So it's a highly organized city, and there are wards between the streets. So this is how it's built in the Chinese manner. There's a palace at the north, there are wards, a symmetrical street pattern, etc. But unlike China, there are no walls. Heian-kyo technically does have a wall, but it's not like a wall we typically think of as being around a city in terms of like, this is built for defense. This is something that's built really just for like boundary purposes. I think at its greatest height it's something like 6 feet, 5-6 feet. It's not that big, it's not that wide. It's just as a boundary. There are no shrines in the city to ancestors of ruling families, and there are no shrines to earth deities like there would be in Chinese cities, because everything in the Japanese way of doing things is the sun. The sun is the key deity. So there are shrines to Amaterasu, there are shrines to the Buddha, there are shrines to other Shinto deities. Nothing really like the Chinese have. Now, when we talk about the development of the Ritsuryo State, these are law codes. So a lot of Chinese culture is coming alongside all these law codes. A lot of that culture, though, is literary. So the old Japanese elite were illiterate, as far as we can tell. Because they are implementing Chinese culture and Chinese way of doing things, the aristocracy needs to become literate, because now they have to understand Chinese religious theory, Chinese political theory, Chinese Buddhism, and Confucianism. You have to be able to read and understand these texts. So what happens is the arrival of Chinese literacy and Chinese writing enables the Japanese to codify all of this. They're able to codify their mythology. Before this, it was basically like oral tradition, which is why if you ever read the early stuff on Shinto and early Japanese primary sources and you have them like laid out next to each other and you go line by line, some stuff will agree, some stuff will disagree, and it will disagree in the extreme because all of these different stories and tales that they eventually record were passed down orally, so oral tradition stuff just changes. But there's a problem. The Japanese developed their own style of writing to go along with the Chinese style of writing, but Chinese and Japanese are different languages. So how do you deal with this? How do you enable the court to understand Chinese stuff if they speak Japanese? And the short answer is, well, you could learn Chinese, and they do this. But there's another way that they can go about doing this. So the first way is kundoku. So kundoku goes in 3 steps. So you read the kanji, the Chinese characters, as a Japanese word. So you take the Chinese character and you just apply the Japanese reading to it. You then change the word order of the characters to accord with Japanese grammar and Japanese syntax. So this is why if you were to write a sentence in Japanese and all you were to use is just the Chinese characters and you give it to a Chinese person, there's a very good chance they could probably read it, but it would just, the order of the words would make the sentence like incomprehensible. Like you could read it, it would just mean nothing to you. So you would have to rearrange the characters to go back to Chinese. So this is what the Japanese do. They read the characters in the Japanese fashion and they rearrange the stuff to accord with how Japanese language is, structured. Then you add the grammatical suffixes and particles, all of which again changes the sentence structure into Japanese. So the Chinese text becomes spoken in the Japanese vernacular, and the Japanese learn this reading technique from childhood. So the Japanese aristocracy is very well versed in Chinese characters, and it allows the reading of Chinese text without learning Chinese. But the second way of doing things is called reverse kundoku. So you write the text in the Chinese word order without the Japanese grammatical markers. So you're reading it in Japanese, but it's still the Chinese system of structuring the language. So it gets weird. And the other way, the third way really, is you could really just learn classical Chinese, which becomes the mark of like an educated person in the Japanese court. So the result of this is that there's a large body of Japanese literature written in all 3 of these methods. So the Japanese literary culture and Japanese culture in general in this period was monolingual by and large. Everybody knew Japanese. It's biliterate. You can read both the Chinese and the Japanese characters, and it's tri-canonical. So you have the kundoku way of reading, you have the reverse kundoku way of reading, and then you have the classical Chinese way of reading. So to be a court aristocrat stresses education. This is part of the reason why, because this is so difficult. And it's part of the reason why many Japanese aristocrats looked down upon the peasants in Japan, because they couldn't do this. There's very much a feeling that, well, I am better than you because I am this highly educated. So this is gradually what develops in the Japanese courts. So to sum everything up, by the start of the Nara period, so 710 roughly, the Ritsuryo State has the following characteristics. So it's a Japanese state organized along Chinese, specifically Tang, political and civil grounds. So there's a Tang political structure, there's a Tang criminal, and a Tang civil law code. They also have Chinese methods of organizing property and collecting taxes. There's the Tenno, the Japanese emperor, based on Chinese models, who works in conjunction with Japanese aristocrats organized in the Chinese fashion. And there's a blend in religion between the indigenous kami worship, what eventually becomes Shinto, and Buddhism. There's also an emphasis on Japanese and Chinese aesthetic. We'll talk about this more in later videos when we talk about court culture in the Heian. So everything ends up being focused around the Tenno, around the emperor. So the emperor is at the apex of several different domains and several different ways of actually obtaining legitimacy and power in Japan in this period. You can obtain power through controlling the realm, the palace, the court aristocracy, the land, Or you can get legitimacy and power through divine means, from kami worship, from Buddhism. So maybe you have a strong association with a Buddhist monastery. They can pray for you, and you then become better than somebody else. You become mightier because you can get priests to get the Buddha and the divine on your side. And you then have this whole notion of, well, I am more powerful, I have more social prestige, because I am more educated than you. I know the Chinese text better than you do. So gradually, as we enter the Nara period and then the Heian, which is when we see the rise of the samurai, the court aristocracy really gets into this stuff, and a lot of what happens becomes, well, I'm better than you because I can recognize this song in 2 notes, and you can do it in 3. I'm better than you because I know more about Chinese literature, and my kimono is a purer shade of white than yours. So it's a lot of that stuff. This is how it develops over time, but keep all this in mind because this is going to impact how court culture develops, and this is going to be the situation, the environment, in which Lady Murasaki writes the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji, in about the year 1000. So in the next video, we'll keep going with this overall theme of the transition from ancient Japan into the classical period, the rise of the samurai, and the Japanese court culture. So until then, I will see you next time.